Hey everybody, it's You Had to Ask, the show where I answer your questions. And my first question this week comes to me from My Thousand Faces, who asks, do you have some favorite comic artists? I have a ton of favorite comic artists. Of guys that are working and sort of popular or noteworthy right now, I really love Gary Frank. I love Andy Kubert. Cliff Chang is really good. So lots of great artists. Throughout my whole comic reading lifetime, probably guys like Jim Aparo or Norm Brayfogle, who are known as Batman artists first and foremost. Klaus Janson is just phenomenal, one of my all-time favorites. Neil Adams, obviously. Frank Miller, much more consistent as an artist than as a writer. Steve Ditko, the original Spider-Man artist, he's awesome. John Romita, who took over for him, also awesome and really helped to define and popularize that Marvel House style. And speaking of the Marvel House style, Jack Kirby, who sort of originated it. The Marvel House style in many ways was just people drawing like Jack Kirby. And for good reason, because he was a phenomenal artist and he had a great style. Carmine Infantino over at DC was great, helped to rejuvenate the Flash in the 50s and Batman in the 60s, just an outstanding artist and incredibly influential. But the greatest comic book artist ever, for me, is Will Eisner. Will Eisner is the paramount genius of all of comic books, if you ask me. He was the creator of the Spirit in the 40s, and he went on to coin the term graphic novel, which isn't a term I really care for. I prefer just to call them comic books. But he wanted comics to be thought of as a more legitimate artistic form, and one of the ways he came up to do that was to not call them comic books anymore, to call them graphic novels. And he wrote and drew the first graphic novels, the first serious attempts at using comics as not only a popular medium, but as an artistic medium, a literary medium, to tell serious personal stories and not just be about superheroes or comic books or crime comics, that sort of thing. And he was just purely as an artist, he was just outstanding. He was an incredibly versatile, expressive, subtle artist and a genius at page layouts, and just Will Eisner. The one name answer to your question of do I have any favorite comic book artists is Will Eisner. Gibberish001, being a huge fan of Superman, do you take issue with him causing physical harm? Considering all the powers ever attributed to Superman, if you were him or had those powers, would you ever feel it necessary to cause physical harm? I know that harm can be subjective, but I'm talking more about times where Superman will punch a being when it doesn't seem necessary, given the great powers that he has. I would much rather see him using those powers to defend than offend. It very much depends on the version of Superman you're talking about, because in the 1950s, in the Superman TV show, the George Reeves Superman, he punched people all the time. And it was okay because that was, generally speaking, with a few exceptions here and there, he was a much weaker version of the character than we've become accustomed to, especially from the comics in our modern age. He was very, very strong. He was invulnerable. He could crash through walls without missing a step, and he could lift up cars. And there was even an episode of that Adventures of Superman show called Panic in the Sky that became a very famous Superman story where he stopped an asteroid from hitting the Earth. So he did have incredible power, but he was never depicted as being so strong that if he punched a guy, he would knock his head off or something like that. So in that situation, it was a little more acceptable for Superman to break into a bank as it's being robbed and subdue the robbers by kind of punching them and knocking them out. That's okay. But if you're going to portray Superman as being strong enough to blow out a star like a candle, as Denny O'Neil once mentioned, then it's troubling to have him beating people up, because yeah, you're right. If a guy is that strong, he really doesn't ever need to be hitting anybody, unless the person he's hitting is stronger than he is, and which would probably mean that they're not from this earth. So yeah, Superman's powers is defensive rather than offensive. I'm kind of with you on that. But overall, not even defensive or offensive, just what does having those powers mean to him, and what does that do to him as a person, and how does that make Superman's life different from the life of an ordinary person, and how does Superman feel about that? Those are the issues that I find really interesting about Superman, not so much how is he using his powers. Jesus Christ, great username. Chariots of the Gods is obviously a BS story. There's proof that humans made the ancient wonders. By attributing them to ancient aliens, we aren't giving our species the credit it deserves. I believe it's not possible just because of the great distances in space. It would have taken too long to get here. Warp drive? My question is, do you agree that it is more plausible that ancient aliens may have visited to study us and were mistaken for angels over the existence of supernatural beings? Oh, sure, it's more plausible than angels. Absolutely, aliens is definitely more plausible than angels. I think anytime I'm sort of I'm Humean in this sense. I think that anytime you can posit a natural explanation, no matter how far-fetched, as long as it falls under the realm of naturalism, I think that should always be considered a more plausible explanation than any supernatural explanation, because there's never been any demonstration that the supernatural exists at all. So a hypothetical natural explanation, no matter how far-fetched, will always be more plausible than a supernatural explanation, unless the supernatural is ever demonstrated to exist. But yeah, but I mean, of course, the most plausible explanation for the angels in the Bible of all is that people made it up. That they weren't aliens observing that were mistaken as angels, and they weren't actually angels. They weren't there at all. They were just inventions of someone telling that story. That's the most plausible explanation of all. But if I only have between the aliens and the angels to choose, then yeah, the aliens are more plausible. Matt Broomfield, Steve, having discovered that a number of my heroes were bigots, racists, or held extreme religious views, I wondered how it affects your respect for and enjoyment of performers like Tom Cruise, Chuck Norris, or indeed author Frank Miller when you discover this dark side to their personality. It makes me shake my head, but if I enjoy their work, whatever that may be it art or movies or whatever, I still enjoy it for the reasons I enjoyed it before. I mean, yeah, when I hear Chuck Norris, you know, sort of spouting the evangelical party line, and when he made that ridiculous commercial a few years ago about how we would have 1,000 years of darkness if Obama were reelected and all that, I mean, it's disappointing in a sense, but it's also so absurd that it's, you know, and it's Chuck Norris. I mean, Chuck Norris is the guy who reacted to those Chuck Norris jokes in a way that suggested he didn't realize he was being made fun of. You know, I mean, there's the Chuck Norris facts. You're making fun of Chuck Norris, right? You're making fun of like how stoic and how his ridiculously tough screen persona, this you know, immovable brick of a man who never loses a fight and never shows any emotion. You're making fun of that. He's being mocked, and he doesn't seem to realize it. He sort of embraced it. It's like, wow, these people think I'm really awesome. Well, sort of, Chuck. You know, sort of. But yeah, Frank Miller being kind of a nutty right-winger these days, and Tom Cruise being just like a space cadet with Scientology. Yeah, it doesn't affect how if Tom Cruise gives a good performance in a film, I give him props for that, and I enjoy that, and it doesn't really affect me. I remember after I saw the movie Ray, about Ray Charles, a friend of a friend reacted very badly to that movie because she had been a fan of Ray Charles all her life and had been inspired by what she took as his story, which she had somehow interpreted the Ray Charles biography as purely through the lens of a guy who overcame handicap and adversity and was able to, you know, have great success and have a wonderful life. And so she took it as this great inspiring story. And she had no idea that he was a huge smack addict and that he was a womanizer and all of the things in his life that are touched on in the movie. And she was just appalled, and she said, I don't know if I could ever listen to his music again, knowing that. I had no idea he was like that. And I kind of feel sorry for people who have that attitude. I think that's a really limiting, close-minded attitude. I mean, yeah, Ray Charles in his personal life may have been a prick, but he still made genius music. You know, Tom Cruise in his personal life may be a complete idiot. He may be a circus freak. But as an actor, I've always liked him. You know, my father used to say, I used to listen to John Lennon music, and my father would say, John Lennon, he was a communist. I don't care. I like the music. I don't care what he was outside of the music. Honey Ace 427. You don't look like a liberal. This unsolicited comment was dropped on me last year while I was stuck in the middle of a 3-hour-long early voting line. What does that even mean? And how does someone's appearance determine their political or social views? I think some of that might be that people tend to assume that other people are like them, absent evidence to the contrary. So if someone saw you standing in an early voting line and they identified with you and they were a conservative, and then they discovered through through what line you were standing in, or however they figured it out, something you said, a shirt you were wearing, whatever, that you were a liberal, that kind of breaks their preconception. Even if that preconception may only be a few minutes old, still it breaks that assumption that they made. Because I mean, I do it too. We just naturally sort of assume that other people are like us, not to a great specificity. I mean, I don't assume that other people are like huge Batman fans and other people, you know, like Buster Keaton movies. I mean, I don't assume that, but in general, my overall outlook, if I see something happen and I think that it was ridiculous or absurd, I look around waiting for other people to notice it too, because I just assume that other people will. You know, I've had similar experience. I was standing in line, not to vote. It was weird. I was actually standing in line at the pharmacy, and the guy in front of me turned around and started talking to me about the Democrats and how the such and such is the Democrats' fault, and you know, they just started making these political statements and complaining about the Democrats, and not in a reasonable way, in like a hysterical talk radio kind of way, and I thought, how does this guy know that I'm not a Democrat? You know, how does he just start talking to me? And technically, I'm not a Democrat. I'm not registered Democrat, but I usually vote Democrat. I mean, I'm definitely a liberal. But he assumed that I was on his side. And I think people just naturally do that. I'm not, maybe it has something to do with evolution. It has to do with our herd mentality. It has to do with our need to sort of bring people to our side and surround ourselves with allies. Maybe that has something to do with it. But it's just, I think it's just a natural inclination that up to a certain point, you just sort of naturally assume that other people are like you. And when that illusion is contradicted, it's kind of jarring, you know, and you say things like, wow, you don't look like a liberal. It doesn't even sound like an odd thing to say in the moment, because, you know, well, you couldn't have been a liberal. I thought you were like me. You know, I think that's kind of how it works. Great Goat on Fire. Steve, do you think that the fact that you have made movies makes you harsher or more forgiving in your views of other movies? A friend of mine and several of his pals was making a full-length armature film 2 years ago, and I was in a 15 to 30-second action scene that took 3 to 4 hours to film. That was a very humbling experience and made me realize the monumental amount of effort that goes into getting any movie made. I don't say things like, I could make a better film, because I know it's not true. Oh yeah, that last bit is absolutely right. Now that I have a few years experience in filmmaking, albeit at a very low independent level, absolutely. It's not, you can't just say, I could make a better movie than that. That's a much more complicated statement than most people realize. It's even more complicated to say I could write a better movie than that. I mean, sometimes I feel like I could, if I would see a really terrible movie. Sometimes I look at that and I think, wow, I could totally write a better movie than that. But even with writing, there are other aspects to be considered. You can't just sit down and type up a screenplay of your dream movie and then hand it in and just expect them to make it. I mean, there are budget concerns, there are casting concerns, there are having to get the right location. I mean, there are all these practical things that encroach on the writing process and impose all of these requirements on the writer. So it's a very complicated thing. You can't just watch a shitty movie and go, I could do better than that. I mean, maybe you could, but maybe you couldn't. Being involved in filmmaking has made me a bit more understanding when critiquing movies that were also made with a low budget, because I've been there and I know how difficult it can be to make a movie with incredibly limited resources. So I do sort of use like a sliding scale when I'm looking at a film as an audience member, as a critic. If it's obvious that it's been made with a very low budget, and the people involved are really trying hard and seem like they might be talented, that would show through a little better if they had a bigger budget or better equipment or etc. I go easier on that, but I am at the same time a lot harder on movies that are made from major studios that have all the money that they could ever need and are still terrible. It works on both ends. I'm more charitable of low budget films that try and fail, and I am far less forgiving of big budget films that don't try nearly as hard as the low budget films and fail. There's something inexcusable about that to me. That you could be handed, a budget, a humongous budget that could, that would fund the film company I work for years. I mean, we could take the budget of a major movie, even a movie that I consider a good movie, like the new Star Trek movie. I thought that was excellent. But if you take the budget for that one movie and give it to us, we could make movies for years off of that. And good movies. I mean, movies that where they wouldn't look cheap and low rent. They would look good. They would look like, good independent films for that kind of money. To just give that amount of money to one movie and then have it turn out half-assed and shitty, and, there's just something unforgivable about that. I'm really, really, really hard on movies like that. Most of my least favorite films, if you ask me to make a list of like the worst movies I've ever seen, almost all of them will be big budget movies or mainstream Hollywood movies. Very, very few of them will be low budget sort of knockoff B movies because I have more compassion for those. David Landon, Steve, need your opinion on this. My wife makes fun of me for being a nerd, which I totally am, so I came up with a good retort, which is, if I'm a nerd, that makes you a nerd fucker. So which is worse, being the nerd or the nerd fucker? Worse being just in the joking kind of way. Being the nerd fucker is worse because you might be a nerd, but at least you don't have to fuck a nerd to get laid. You're welcome. You can have that one. You can use that. Alright, well, there's the thunder, and you know what that means. Where there's thunder, there's...
The lightning round. Rapid fire questions. Glib and adequate answers.
Edward Keel, Marvel or DC? WWE, WWF, or WCW? Well, the first one's easy, DC for me. The second one, though, is tricky because I loved both companies back in the day. Late 80s, WCW, before the Crockett's sold out to Turner when it was still in NWA territory, it was just fucking amazing. But I probably would have to go WWF. That's just mostly what I grew up with, mostly what I love. But it's close. It's a tough one. Blood Toker, what are your favorite pizza toppings? What brand of toothpaste do you use? Pizza toppings, I like pepperoni and sausage, and sometimes some onion. A good, like, caramelized onion, sweet onion would be really nice on a pizza. What brand of toothpaste? Crest. I'm a Crest man. This is 3D. Are you a Doctor Who fan? No, I don't think I've ever watched more than a stray episode here or there of Doctor Who, and the episodes I've seen have all been of the older versions. The revival I haven't seen any of. Not to say I wouldn't enjoy it if I watched it, I've just never watched it and never really felt motivated to get into it. Sensible Oxymoron, who's your favorite stand-up comedian? That would be Louis C.K. I think he's a genius. Second place, probably Mike Birbiglia. He's great too. Totally different styles, but both great comedians. Precambrian Lullaby. Hey Steve, what is a hipster? I've used the word before, but it always seems as a derogatory used loosely to jab at someone. I've never actually met anyone who's self-identified as a hipster, so I'm led to wonder, what is exactly it? Well, I would tell you what a hipster is, but you probably wouldn't get it. That's a hipster, right there. Hey, Johnny Park. Hey, Steve, are you optimistic about what's left of the 21st century? Yes. I am, in all honesty. I'm optimistic about the future. Mikey Anatomy. Hey Steve, do you plan on or thinking about starting a new series of videos like a Q&A with friends, or more debates, or more Steve and Stuffy vids? To be honest, I'm kind of missing Stuffy. Yeah, I'm missing Stuffy too. Stuffy will be back probably in about 2 weeks from when this video is posted. After I'm done with the current An Atheist Reads series, I'm going to take about 2 weeks off and I'm going to do some Stuffy videos to sort of fill that gap. I miss Stuffy too. I love the stuffed animal videos. I think they're some of my favorite things that I do of mine. And the other ideas are really good too. I would love to do some more like live Google Hangouts. I mean, I know there are limitations to that. I'm not crazy about the Google Hangout or the live webcast thing just in terms of video quality. I think it looks like shit. But it's fun, and I think that outweighs the fun aspect, and the interaction with other people outweighs the technical downside. So I probably some more stuff like that from time to time. Let's do a shout out before we get out of here. That's it for the questions. The shout out this week, like last week with Monkey Tail, is long overdue. It's someone who I've been meaning to give a shout out to for a while. And it's FSX23. He's really sharp and really smart and really good at addressing apologetics. He's done a couple of videos about the presuppositional apologetic, which I'm familiar with from talking to Cy Ten Bruggencate about it. And he just put up a video, I think last week, addressing a point in the presuppositional argument that was really interesting, that was sort of an example of Cy changing his terms in mid-argument without acknowledging it and hoping that you won't notice, and using that to try and trap people. And it's just an illustration of what a complicated and intentionally confounding argument it is, and how it's just a dishonest argument and not a very good argument, and that's why it's not very convincing to people who don't already believe in its conclusion. So it's a really good video and a really good channel. FSX23, subscribe to that channel. It is definitely worth a look and worth your time. It's good stuff. So that is it for this week. I will be back once again, as Chris Jericho might say, to do this next week, providing, of course, that you ask me some questions, because as you no doubt know by now, in order for me to do this, you have to ask. So please, leave a comment on this video. Ask me a question about anything you want to hear me run my fucking mouth about. No subject is off limits. Nothing is too personal. Nothing is too nerdy. Nothing is too inconsequential. Nothing is too serious and sobering and the kind of thing that would just make people uncomfortable to talk about. I would love to talk about that stuff in a video. So leave a question, leave a comment. I will answer as many questions as I possibly can in the next episode of this series, which will be next week. And until then, I will see ya. Take it easy.